I'm Brendan Glenn, and welcome to Smashcourse. Today, we're going to be talking about the history of racism in the American workplace. Finn, roll the music. When the slaves were freed at the end of the American Civil War, there came an opportunity to reform American society for the better. Unfortunately, America failed. Hard. To illustrate that, we're going to be looking at the economic segregation and discrimination that forms the root of a lot of these racial issues facing the country. So I'll start at the beginning and show you how all of this was brought about by our star-spangled past. At the beginning of the Reconstruction era, in 1865, millions of freedmen moved north into cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston in order to secure increased mobility, higher wages, and security for themselves and their families. Boston actually provides a pretty good example for the way African American discrimination worked in these towns. Ghettoization refers to the action of confining a group of people into a segregated residential community. So, Boston's black population grew from 2,000 in 1850 to 11,591 in 1900 as a result of this migration of Southern African Americans. From the perspective of the white people in the city, this was scary, to put it plainly. A lot of white people were avowedly racist at the time. And so they moved to different and more affluent areas of the city. Since only 5% of black families could afford to own a house, the high level of residential segregation led to crowded living quarters in the African American districts. African Americans were essentially cordoned off into a specific dilapidated part of the city and restricted to low-skilled labor that left them with little money and even less of a chance for career advancement. To give you a better understanding, 82% of black males were working menial jobs at the beginning of the 20th century. But no racism there, right, America? Ghettoization wasn't the only problem faced by African Americans, though. Introducing the Jim Crow laws for when the past isn't sad and dark enough. The Jim Crow system, created by the Southern states in the 1880s, was a system of laws that maintained institutional segregation of and discrimination towards African Americans. By being barred from entering higher-paying jobs and having their upward mobility in the workplace stopped, African Americans were kept in a deep, dark hole of socioeconomic despair. However, in some cities, like Jacksonville, Florida, African Americans were able to do something about their impoverished conditions. Despite their disadvantages during the era of Jim Crow, African Americans in Florida actually made a surprising amount of economic progress. The middle-class African-American business people of Jacksonville especially were referred to as aristocrats of color, men and women who attained formal educations, worked in respected occupations, and accumulated wealth by following strict rules that mirrored those of the white middle class. All over Florida, the number of African-American small businesses rose as they gained access to jobs that weren't just manual labor. Then, in 1906, leading African-American business people organized the FSNBL, Florida State Negro Business League, which operated as a chamber of commerce that aimed to stimulate black business development throughout the country. Things had begun to look up for African Americans in Florida, but in the rest of the nation, little lasting progress was being made. Luckily, America was soon thrown into the terror and change of World War I. World War I was horrific. It killed 17 million people and changed the world in many ways, a lot of them for the worse. But for African Americans, it was actually a really good thing, because turns out unambiguous positives aren't allowed in history, it seems. Before the war, the treatment of African Americans in industry was similar to their treatment on plantations. Northern white industrialists saw African Americans as cheap, efficient labor, willing to work in the most physically demanding jobs for very little pay. World War I shifted the status quo as factories found themselves with too few employees, what with the massive army being sent overseas. African American women during this time found textile industry jobs by replacing white domestic immigrants moving into industrial northern cities, and African American men were recruited to join the Allied cause following America's entry into the war. The increase in the number of working African American women also partly led to the organization of unions like the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which fought for female workers' rights. After World War I came the Great Depression, broadly speaking, which worsened the situation for African Americans along with everybody else, at least up until the beginning of World War II. War. It makes things better. Anyway, as World War II was in full swing and all the strong, patriotic men were off to fight in the war, vacancies and jobs started to spring up everywhere, especially in industry. Naturally, this caused a shift in the workplace for all races and genders. This shift led to many African American women leaving stay-at-home mothering and domestic labor for higher-paying factory work. In fact, during World War II, 600,000 of the approximate 1 million African Americans that joined the workforce were women. There was a 14% decrease in domestic jobs for them. Unfortunately, a lot of places still didn't hire black women. A survey from the United Auto Workers Organization in April of 1943 found that only 74 out of 280 automobile factories were willing to hire African American women. This was largely the result of persistent racism at every level of white society. For instance, in 1943, 2,000 white women who worked at a rubber plant walked out on the job because there weren't segregated bathrooms. After World War II came further increases in unionization. It's difficult to tell if unions had an overall positive or negative effect on African Americans. On the one hand, some unions were accepting of African American labor and helped African Americans who would have otherwise been employed find a job. This meant that African Americans could possibly achieve a higher place in the American workforce and increase their socioeconomic status. Labor unions helped African Americans get higher pay and more job security. On the other hand, labor unions such as the AFL actively sought to control all good jobs and keep them in white hands. As a collective, they would force owners of businesses to never employ African Americans. These groups would also often use the threat of the Red Scare and claim that the unions that black people worked in were communist groups, and no one likes a communist, obviously. Occasionally, African American workers would be caught in the crossfire of labor disputes as well. White workers went on strike in a meatpacking plant, and as the peaceful black workers walked to their plant, strikers and riot police viciously attacked them. For the next 2 decades, America was engaged in a battle over the equality of African Americans in the Civil Rights Movement. Eventually, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 mandated equality for all people in the workplace specifically. It stated that discrimination against sex, religion, race, skin color, or culture could not be used to deny people jobs. With the advent of this act, ideas of equality in the workplace officially began to take hold. That isn't to say, however, that everything was perfect. It's also pretty clear that it took a really long time for any actual noticeable and persistent change and progress to occur. And for the record, all of the problems I've talked about still exist in modern-day America. They weren't solved after 1965. This episode of Smashcourse was brought to you by our producer, Ryan Jackson, our cameraman, Finn Erringer, and our grammar manager, Shintania.